Hey guys, tonight we are taking a different kind of journey. One that doesn't involve lofty ideas or grand philosophies, but still digs deep into the textures of the past. Let's step quietly into the haze of the American frontier, not into the battlegrounds or the gold rushes, but into the quieter chaos of a place you might not think about too often. The saloon kitchen. The Wild West is usually pictured in sepia tones, with wide-open skies, crooked teeth, and the clang of spurred boots on wooden floors. But we rarely ask, what did people actually eat behind those swinging doors? What filled their bellies after the gunfire died down, when the poker chips were spent and the whiskey bottle nearly dry? Before we plunge in, settle in yourself. Dim the lights. Let the hum of your fan become the background breeze of the prairie. Maybe close your eyes as we step back in time, not to the well-manicured west of Hollywood, but the gritty, hungry, sweat-stained version where food wasn't served with flair, but scraped into bowls by people who'd survived too much to care about presentation. The first thing that would hit you upon entering one of those infamous frontier saloons wasn't music or voices. It was odor, a scent that told the whole story in one aggressive breath. This wasn't the alluring aroma of roasted meat and fresh bread wafting from a farmhouse oven. No, it was a tangy, stubborn bouquet of everything unwashed, unfiltered, and unflinching. Imagine the musk of unbathed ranch hands, thick with tobacco, layered over wooden walls swollen with moisture and spilt beer. Horses lingered just outside, sometimes inside. And if the wind was right and luck was on your side, there might be the faintest trace of something edible cooking behind the bar. Some establishments tried to control the smell. They scattered sawdust across the floor to soak up blood and beer. Others kept pipe smoke hanging in the air like a protective fog. But nobody really expected a saloon to smell good. That wasn't the point. As one barkeep might grunt while chasing a fly with a rag older than the building, you don't come here to sniff, you come here to forget. Yet even amid that clamor and chaos, food was served. Often grudgingly, often charred, sometimes suspicious. But it was there, a pot simmering in the back, a crusty pan sizzling on a makeshift stove. In the corner, a solitary figure might be ladling something thick and brown into chipped bowls, using a wooden spoon that looked more like a cudgel. You didn't ask what was in it. You didn't want to know. You just prayed it had been cooked long enough to kill whatever might have been alive in it yesterday. There were no printed menus, no servers, no romantic candlelight. Just rough tables, chairs that threatened collapse, and one counter long enough to lean against if your legs gave out. Regulars didn't place orders. They shouted monosyllables like beans or stew, with the tone of someone placing a bet, not requesting a meal. And that's what saloon food was. A gamble. You weren't dining for pleasure. You were eating for endurance. To quiet a stomach that had grumbled since sunrise. To brace yourself for another night of gambling losses, unpredictable violence, or aimless wandering. To fill the silence between heartbreaks and hangovers. And at the center of that culinary survivalism stood one ingredient that fed the frontier better than bullets and bourbon: beans. They were the unbreakable spirit of the saloon kitchen. Not because they tasted good, God, no, but because they worked. Beans didn't spoil, they didn't complain. They didn't cost much. And if you were a cowboy who hadn't seen anything green since Missouri, a hot scoop of beans felt like a favor from the heavens. They came in all colors and sizes: pinto, navy, black. But variety didn't matter. What mattered was that they could be boiled into something resembling food over a sputtering flame for half a day and served without shame. Toss in some salt pork if the bar was flush, or more likely, a dusty lump of fat cut from something older than you. Add stale bread, maybe a biscuit if it was Tuesday, and that was your meal. No seasoning unless dust counts. No presentation unless the cook accidentally wiped the edge of the bowl. They were, in every sense, humble. And yet, those beans fed cattle drives that lasted weeks. They kept card sharks awake through nights of whiskey and deceit. They filled miners before long days spent chasing ghosts through stone, and they came with their own kind of danger, not from spoilage, but from aftermath. 10 men in a room eating beans wasn't just a recipe for indigestion, it was a threat to local peace. Some say bar fights didn't begin with insults or cheating, but with one silent betrayal drifting up from under the table. That's how serious beans were. They nourished, they offended, they endured. Even when everything else had run dry, the meat, the coffee, the patience, beans remained. Cold, no problem. Burnt, still edible. They could be traded, stored, and if you had nothing left but a handful of them and a good story, you might even bargain for a mule, or, if legend holds true, a wife. The truth is, in the grand drama of the American West, beans were more than food. They were the baseline, the dusty drumbeat of daily life. Nobody waxed poetic about them, but everyone respected them, and in a world where so little was dependable, that counted for something. If beans were the foundation, the drumbeat, the enduring spirit of the Wild West kitchen, then salt pork was its gristly, greasy backbone. Not bacon, though folks like to pretend otherwise. No, this wasn't the kind of pork you'd slap onto a Sunday breakfast plate with a smile. Salt pork was a slab of meat so thoroughly cured, it could survive a desert crossing, a barroom beating, and 2 months at the bottom of a saddlebag and still look the same. Whether that was comforting or terrifying was up for debate. This meat was often cut from the belly of the pig, thick with fat, soaked in salt, and sometimes smoked just enough to convince it to stay civilized. It didn't rot quickly, though it did age, and age in the West wasn't a number. It was a smell. It was a color. It was how long the cook squinted before declaring it probably still good. When fried properly, salt pork could almost pass for something delicious. Tossed onto a skillet sizzling with fire-licked grease, it crackled and hissed its way into acceptability. Crispy edges, molten fat, and a sudden crunch that might make you forget for a moment that the rest of your dinner came from a dented tin can. But more often than not, it was cooked poorly, too fast, too slow, too drunk, and what landed on your plate could be a rubbery, salt-licked square of sinew that took more jaw strength than a bar fight. Biting into it might feel like chewing on a salted leather boot left too close to the fire. Yet still, Cowboys chewed. Because this wasn't about flavor, it was about calories, and fat was currency. Every scrap of that pork was put to use. The grease? It slicked pans for frying potatoes or biscuits. The rind? It was tossed into stews, tossed to the dogs, or if the cook was in a foul mood, tossed onto a newcomer's plate just to watch them learn the truth the hard way. One bite, and they understood the barkeep's warning. Chew slow or choke proud. And while most saloon patrons accepted their fate, some couldn't help but notice when the pork turned odd. Maybe it had a green shimmer, maybe it smelled like old regret. But in these places, the test wasn't, is it fresh? The test was, did it kill anyone yesterday? If the answer was no, you rolled the dice. Despite the risks, salt pork was a mainstay. Because it lasted, it traveled, it filled you up. It didn't ask questions and didn't care who you were. It made beans edible. It made stew passable. It made whiskey feel justified. And so we come to stew, the great equalizer of the frontier. The Wild West's answer to, I don't know what this is, but we're going to cook it anyway. A bubbling cauldron of heat and hope, the stew pot welcomed all comers. Didn't matter what it was, meat, vegetable, root, or unidentifiable chunk of something that used to be alive. If it could be boiled, it belonged. The process was part recipe, part exorcism. Water first, always. Maybe some old beans. If you had potatoes, they were diced and drowned. Then came the meat, or what qualified as meat. Beef was ideal. Rabbit, more common. Squirrel? Absolutely. Rattlesnake? If it wasn't still wiggling, in it went. Sometimes you'd find something in your bowl that wasn't quite food. A bit of leather, a string from a boot. One traveler once said the best part of his stew was the shoelace. It had flavor, it had chew, and it didn't bite back. Vegetables didn't fare much better. Carrots became orange shadows, onions dissolved into whispers, potatoes held on until the third boil, then gave up entirely. What remained in the pot was a brownish-gray slurry, thick as wet clay, hot enough to burn your doubts away. And just salty enough to stop you from asking where the meat came from. As for spices, forget it. Spices were luxuries found in city kitchens and rich men's dreams. Most stews in the West got their seasoning from whatever happened to be on the cook's hands. If you were lucky, you caught a dash of black pepper. If you were really lucky, someone had chili powder and your sinuses were in for a cleansing you wouldn't forget. But no matter how murky, stew was warmth. It was weight in your stomach. It was a reason to keep going. You didn't eat it for joy. You ate it because you needed to. Because the dessert was cold, the wind was merciless, and your options were stew. Or regret. Maybe tobacco, if you could stomach it. But stew had heat. And sometimes that was enough. Cooks would stretch one pot for days, adding water when it ran low, meat when it was found, and prayers when nothing else remained. By the third day, the stew had developed a soul, angry, mysterious, and deeply suspicious. But you still ate it, because even bad stew had its place in the ritual of survival. And in the West, survival always tasted just a little bit burnt. If the stew warmed your belly, then bread filled the rest of the space with dignity, or at least with density. No meal in a saloon was complete without something bread-like to scoop, mop, or soak the leftovers. And in the Wild West, that meant you were handed either a biscuit that felt like a gift, or a piece of hardtack that felt like a punishment. Biscuits, when made right, were minor miracles. Soft, flaky, touched by butter or at least some grease, they gave cowboys the briefest illusion that they'd wandered into a real kitchen. A kitchen with care, a kitchen with love, a kitchen that didn't use the same pan for food, fights, and shoe repair. They were rare, though. Few cooks had the patience or ingredients. Fewer had the talent, but those who did, those blessed few, were spoken of in hushed tones across county lines. The secrets varied. Some swore it was lard, others buttermilk. Some just relied on luck and desperation. These biscuits were usually made in blackened cast-iron pans over open flame, served with stew, dunked into beans, or eaten straight with a suspicious smear of butter that may or may not have started life as butter. And on lucky days, you might get a splash of molasses, a thick, dark sweetness that turned dry carbs into a dessert good enough to make a grown man tear up behind his hat brim. But then there was hardtack. If biscuits were a promise, hardtack was a test, a slab of flour and water baked until the fire gave up and the bread refused to die. It wasn't just stale, it was eternal. A leftover from military rations and seafaring voyages, hardtack had crossed oceans and decades to end up in your bowl, next to stew it didn't love and beans it didn't fear. Hardtack wasn't eaten, it was survived. First, you examined it, because it might contain surprises. Insects, mostly. Not always alive, but not always dead either. Weevils were common, but not deal-breakers, more like extra protein. Then came the soaking. You dunked the hardtack in whatever you had on hand. Stew, coffee, whiskey, even spit if things were desperate. The goal was to soften it enough that your teeth wouldn't crack like dry timber. Some men took minutes, others took hours. A few simply stared at it until their appetite faded. But for those brave enough to bite, hardtack offered one thing: sustenance. It stayed with you, physically, emotionally, sometimes dentally, and while you didn't love it, you understood it. It didn't lie. It was food, barely, but food. Cowboys didn't ask for variety. They asked for volume. Bread, whatever form it took, was there to carry other food. It absorbed grease, soothed the burn of bad coffee, and filled the empty spaces stew couldn't reach. In a world where calories meant survival, bread wasn't a side dish. It was a lifeline. And speaking of burn, let's talk about coffee. Cowboy coffee didn't just wake you up. It challenged you to a duel. It wasn't filtered. It wasn't gentle. It was a potion boiled from anger and need. A brew so black it absorbed light. So thick, it might still have teeth. Forget baristas. This was made by men who measured ground by fistfuls and boiled water until it bubbled like lava. The recipe was simple. Water, hopefully clean. Coffee grounds, probably not. A kettle, scarred and black. You threw it all together, set it over the fire, and waited for the liquid to turn the color of vengeance. Then you drank it. Grounds and all. No straining, no questions. Just grit and gulp. And oh, did it hit. The first sip could strip paint. The last could rebuild your spine. The bottom of the cup was a muddy blend of caffeine and sorrow. But it kept you awake during cold desert mornings. It kept you warm when the whiskey ran out. It helped digest beans and boiled meat. It kept you human. Barely. Saloon coffee wasn't always on offer. Not unless there was a kitchen, or a cook who still cared enough to keep a pot going. But if it was available, it came hot, bitter, and unforgiving. Cowboys grimaced, they swore. They smiled through gritted teeth, and they kept coming back for more. Some called it a drink, others called it fuel. A few just called it survival in a cup. Because in the Wild West, even your coffee had a temper. Meat in the Wild West wasn't just food, it was treasure. A slab of it sizzling in a pan could silence a room. A whiff of fat crackling over flame could summon cowboys like a hymn. If you could afford it, you walked into a saloon with hope and ordered steak. But what you received depended on a cocktail of fortune, timing, and whether the cook held a grudge against your face. In theory, steak was the crown jewel of saloon meals. In reality, it was usually a tough, overcooked fragment of beef, scorched in lard and slapped onto a plate like an afterthought. No garnishes, no sauces, no requests for doneness. Ask for it rare, and you might just get a stare so cold it curdled milk. Medium? The only thing medium in that kitchen was the cook's temper. If beef couldn't be found, and it often couldn't, other options stepped in. Jerky that had traveled for weeks. Salted buffalo hacked into submission. Venison if a hunter had luck. Wild boar if someone had real luck. And in desperate stretches of desert or mountain, anything with legs and a heartbeat was fair game. Squirrel stew, roasted jackrabbit, even snake if it had stopped moving long enough to catch. Some meats came with questions, not the kind you asked out loud. More the kind that lived in the silence between bites. If your food tasted like something you didn't recognize, you didn't look too closely. If it chewed like something with a name once, you swallowed and chased it with whiskey. In the worst cases, the meat had a personality, a twitch, a flavor that spoke in riddles. But you were hungry, and hunger overruled suspicion. Age was another concern. Some meats were fresh, others were veterans. Pieces that had aged in saddlebags, hung too long near a stove, or been resurrected from the bottom of a stew pot. The cook would slice off the parts that looked offended and drown the rest in thick gravy. If it didn't move, it was served. But once in a while, rare as gold, you'd get a meal that stopped time. A thick-cut steak cooked just right, with the edges crisp and the center juicy. Maybe even topped with a fried egg and served next to a biscuit that hadn't shattered like plaster. In those moments, the saloon felt like heaven's doorstep. And for a few bites, you remembered why people crossed deserts and dodged bullets for this kind of life. But just as fast, that moment passed. The fire burned out. The meat returned to mystery, and the cook, grumbling, sweating, armed with a pan and a cleaver, returned to making food that filled bellies more than hearts. And what of dessert? Now there's a laugh. Dessert in a saloon was not a certainty. It was an accident, a miracle wrapped in crumbs. If it existed at all, it came in the form of cornbread, not the soft, buttery, golden triangles of southern dreams. This was something else. Drier, denser, a little bitter, a little sweet. Depending on who made it and how long it had been sitting near the fire. Cornbread was forged from cornmeal, water or milk, and whatever fat the cook hadn't already used to fry pork. Sometimes a bit of baking powder if they had it, sometimes not. The result was a wedge that could crumble or chip a tooth depending on the day. And if you were lucky, it came warm. More often, it arrived stiff, sunburned by stove heat and hard enough to knock on. But that's where molasses came in. Dark, sticky, patient molasses. A syrupy river of sweetness that could turn dry bread into something close to divine. A drizzle of it could make you forget the meal had started with rattlesnake stew. Saloon kitchens that kept a barrel of molasses were considered refined, civilized even, if they warmed it before serving. You might believe, briefly, that you'd stumbled into a 5-star establishment with dust on the floors and a revolver by the register. Some cooks even poured it over fried cornbread and added a pinch of salt or spice, transforming it into a dish that wasn't quite cake, but came close enough for men who hadn't seen a bakery in years. Cornbread and molasses wasn't just dessert, it was reassurance. Proof that even in a brutal world, something soft still existed. No icing, no cream, no lace doilies or silver spoons. Just grit, grain, and gooey survival. And somehow, that was enough. Because when you spent your days herding cattle, dodging bullets, and sleeping next to regrets in the shape of mules, dessert didn't need to sparkle. It just needed to remind you that not everything in the West was trying to kill you. In the Wild West, breakfast wasn't guaranteed. It was a reward. If you stumbled into a saloon before noon, sober, upright, and not bleeding, you might just be offered the crown jewels of frontier morning fare, eggs and chicken. And if that happened, you were either incredibly lucky or about to be the punchline of a very grim joke. Fresh eggs were currency, fragile, rare, and guarded like treasure. Chickens weren't pets. They were walking breakfast factories with feathers and attitudes. Keeping one alive long enough to lay was a challenge. They were prone to wandering off, getting stolen, eaten or snatched by foxes, children, or fate. So if eggs appeared on your plate, it meant someone had either raised their own hens, paid handsomely for local stock, or had a very discreet arrangement with someone in the next town over. You didn't ask what kind of egg it was. You didn't ask how old. You didn't even ask if it was cooked. You just looked down, took a breath, and hoped it didn't wiggle. Some cooks scrambled them until they turned gray. Others fried them until the yolks hardened into something resembling saddle leather. And on rare, bewildering mornings, you'd get one with a soft center and a sprinkle of salt. A cowboy once claimed it made him believe in God again. Chicken was the second half of this fragile dream. Fried chicken, the menu might say, though fried often meant incinerated. The bird itself was usually small, angry, and long past its prime. Tough, bony, and fried in enough lard to fuel a lantern, it wasn't always worth the fight. But it wasn't beans, and in a place where food mostly came from cans, barrels, or regret, that mattered. Sometimes you got a drumstick no bigger than your thumb. Other times, a quarter piece roasted over open flame, still wearing the memory of feathers. Once in a while, your gravy came with an actual feather. That wasn't a mistake. That was charm. It meant the bird had been real, and recently. Eggs and chicken were more than breakfast. They were symbols of effort, of luck, of civilization encroaching ever so slightly on chaos. If the eggs were warm and the chicken wasn't dry, you talked about it for weeks. If it made you sick, you drank whiskey and blamed your own weakness. But either way, you remembered it. Because in the Wild West, breakfast wasn't just a meal. It was a quiet miracle. And speaking of miracles, let's talk pie. In a saloon, pie wasn't dessert. It was a revelation. If you saw one sitting on the bar, crust steaming, fruit scent floating above the smoke, you knew someone in the kitchen had poured their soul into it. Pie meant effort. Pie meant care. Pie meant someone had taken the time to do something more than just open a can and stir, but temper your expectations. This wasn't a magazine cover pastry. No golden lattice, no farm-fresh fillings. Wild West pie was rustic. Crusts were uneven. Fruit came from tins, dried pouches, or whatever hadn't gone sour. The slice was served lukewarm if you were lucky, cold if you weren't, and heaven forbid you asked for whipped cream. Unless a cow had followed you into town, dairy was not on the menu. Apple, peach, sometimes berry, though berry could mean anything from raisins to something purple that grew behind the outhouse. If the cook had a sweet tooth, you got cinnamon. If not, you got hope and sugar. And still, it was magic. Because for most cowboys, that slice of pie was the closest thing to home they'd tasted since leaving it. Saloons that served pie gained reputations. Good pie drew customers from miles away. Men crossed rivers and rode dusty trails for it. And when it was good, flaky, warm, perfectly sweet, fights broke out over the last piece. Actual fights. Guns drawn, chairs thrown. There are stories, maybe exaggerated, maybe not, of poker games ending in violence over dessert. In the Wild West, you took the last slice was a cause for blood. Not all pies were legendary. Some were mostly crust. Some were mostly confusion. Some had fillings that might have been fruit in a past life. But every now and then, you got a pie that reminded you why civilization was trying so hard to push westward. Why people endured storms and scorpions and stubborn mules. Because sometimes, just sometimes, you ended a hard day with a warm slice of something sweet and a memory you could hold on to. And then there was cheese. Ah, yes. Cheese in the Wild West, a gamble within a gamble. A wedge of mystery wrapped in risk. You didn't find cheese often, but when you did, it was never what you expected. It might be hard. Yellow. Sweating in the heat like a nervous preacher. Or it might be soft, crumbling and aromatic in a way that made men reconsider their relationship with dairy. There was no refrigeration. None. Unless the saloon was built over a cave or winter had moved in early, that cheese had been aging in real time. It might have been cheddar, it might have been Swiss, it might have been milk's last mistake. If it squeaked when you bit into it, well, that was between you and your dentist. But cheese served a purpose. It went well with bread. It broke up the saltiness of everything else. And on rare days, it was even melted over beans or cornbread, giving your meal a sudden, glorious richness. You didn't question it, you just ate. Because the person who dared to serve cheese in a saloon wasn't doing it for profit, they were doing it as a flex. And sometimes, it wasn't even cheese at all. Some cooks stretched definitions. Aged butter gone wrong, curdled milk packed tight, maybe rolled in pepper to throw you off the scent. It didn't matter. Because even bad cheese was still cheese, and in a world where the barroom doubled as a jail, church and funeral parlor, cheese was sophistication. So you tapped it with your fork, you sniffed, you said a quiet prayer, and then you ate. Because the West didn't wait for cowards, and neither did the cheese. In the Wild West, preservation wasn't optional, it was the law of hunger. And if something could be soaked in vinegar and forgotten in a jar, you could bet it would end up on a saloon shelf. Pickled food wasn't just garnish. It was insurance. It didn't spoil, didn't wilt, didn't die quietly in the back room. It waited. Sharp, unforgiving, eternal. Pickled cucumbers were the classic standby. Green, mostly. Crunchy, hopefully. Served in thick slices beside beans or stew, or alone on a plate like a warning. Some were homemade, steeped in brine with garlic and bite. Others were relics, sour as betrayal and soft as regret. They cleansed palates and burned tongues. They chased whiskey and punctuated bad decisions. Then came the eggs, pickled eggs. Ghostly orbs floating in cloudy jars behind every bar, looking more like preserved experiments than food. White and slick, rubbery to the touch, they were swallowed more as proof of bravery than appetite. Some cowboys loved them, swore by them, called them protein in a pinch. Others swore at them and left the bar shortly after. Pickled onions, common in mining towns, hard, tangy, powerful. One bite and your breath could clear a poker table. Even fruit wasn't safe. Peaches and pears, once sweet, were dunked in spiced vinegar until they emerged as something new. Not quite dessert, not quite side dish, just wet defiance. A reminder that sweet and sour could hold hands when survival required it. The beauty of pickled goods was shelf life. You could stack jars high, forget about them for months, and they'd still be there. Waiting. Unmoved by mold or mice. They were the backup plan when meat went bad, bread went stale, and even the cook needed a moment to recover. But not all pickled goods were safe. Some were suspicious. Some looked back. There were rumors, always whispered, of men biting into pickled sausages and finding bones, or labels that read, "Maybe pork. You ate carefully, or you didn't." Either way, you remembered. But when food ran out entirely, when the beans were burnt and the bread was older than the town, there was one thing that never failed. Whiskey. It was more than drink. It was dinner. Whiskey in the Wild West wasn't about savoring notes of oak and vanilla. It was about forgetting your hunger, numbing your bad decisions, and convincing your stomach you'd been fed. Made from corn, rye, sorghum, or whatever the barkeep had lying around, it was distilled in back rooms, barns, or barrels that hadn't been cleaned since the last fist fight. Some called it rot gut, others liquid lightning. A few just called it lunch. It came in cracked glasses or straight from the bottle. No ice, no mixer, no ceremony. One shot could clean wounds, strip paint, and start a brawl. 2 could quiet a stomach full of spoiled stew. 3, and you might forget what stew even was. It was fuel, it was sedative, it was bravery, swallowed in one burning gulp. Saloons offered whiskey specials, cheap drinks with a biscuit or a scoop of beans, not for taste, but to keep you upright. Some brave souls floated pickled eggs in their glass, a horrific combination of alcohol and gelatin that counted as both hydration and nutrition. And when you were too broke for food, a few shots of whiskey would at least stop your belly from reminding you. And in the haze, behind the bar, past the smoke and the shouting, stood the most important figure in the whole damn saloon, the cook. You rarely saw them, but you always felt them. They were the gods of the stove, the priests of the pot. Sometimes saints, sometimes sinners, always armed with a ladle and a level of exhaustion that could shatter steel. They didn't wear white aprons or polished boots. They wore soot, grease, wrath. Their kitchens weren't rooms. They were corners of chaos. A stove, a pan, a fire that didn't ask questions. These cooks were rarely trained. They were ex-miners, ex-convicts, ex-soldiers, ex-somethings who knew how to kill a rabbit, start a fire, and stretch a pot of stew until it had an afterlife. Their spoons were weapons, their pans doubled as shields, and their moods were not to be trifled with. On good days, they made miracles. Biscuits that flaked, beans that didn't bite back, cornbread with just enough sweetness to chase away despair. But on bad days, The meat was gray. The stew shimmered with oil that moved even when the pot didn't. You didn't complain. You couldn't, because in the food chain of the West, the cook was judge, jury, and executioner. If they liked you, you got the freshest meat. If they didn't, you got the scrapings, and maybe a look that said you wouldn't survive breakfast. Cooks were more than chefs. They were bouncers, enforcers. Barkeeps back up. They could silence a room with a cleaver or a stare. One slam of a ladle, and even the drunk in the corner sat straight. They fed everyone, knew everyone, and decided who walked away full and who crawled away regretting. They stood behind the curtain of heat and smoke, holding your next meal and your fate in grease-slicked hands. And somehow, despite the chaos, despite the questionable ingredients, despite the violence of flavor and the gamble of every bite, they kept the saloon alive. They were the unacknowledged kings of the Wild West. By now, we've walked through the threshold of the Wild West saloon more than once. Smelled the beans, braved the stew, stared down a pickled egg, and lived to tell the tale. And still, a question bubbles beneath it all, steady and unavoidable. What would it take to sit down at one of those rough-hewn tables, press your boots into sawdust, and eat? Because this wasn't just food. It was endurance served hot. The kind of meal that didn't arrive with grace, but with a clatter, a grunt, maybe a fly or two, and a silent dare. It didn't flatter the senses. It tested them. The beans were a given. You didn't love them. You didn't hate them. You respected them the way a rider respects a stubborn horse. Salt pork? You hoped it was cooked. Stew? You prayed it was meat. Bread and biscuits weren't companions to the meal. They were shields, barriers between your mouth and whatever lurked in the bowl beneath. And the coffee? That wasn't a beverage. That was a rite of passage. Would you sit down anyway? The answer depends on whether you measure a meal by taste or by truth. Because saloon food, for all its roughness, was honest. Brutally, blisteringly honest. It didn't pretend to be elegant. It never tried to be kind. It filled you up so you could face the next mile, the next fight, the next cold morning under an open skui with your saddle as a pillow. In that sense, the saloon table wasn't just a place to eat. It was where the line between man and myth was softened by steam, scorched meat, and shared silence. It was where cowboys traded nothing but looks over soup that might have had squirrel in it, or something worse. It was where the cook's ladle had more authority than the sheriff's badge. And it was where you learned that survival had a flavor, and it wasn't always good, but it was always earned. So no, it wasn't about the taste. It was about the story, the one that clung to every chipped bowl and blackened skillet, every biscuit that cracked like bone, every pan of beans that refused to die. Because when your dinner could also double as currency, weapon, or warning, you understood something deeper than flavor. You understood the West, long before needles buzzed behind neon glass in tattoo parlors, before names were etched onto knuckles, before dragons coiled across backs, before ink became rebellion or fashion or faith. There was only skin, pain, and meaning. And in that beginning, there was a man, frozen in time, wrapped in ice, preserved not by intention, but by accident and destiny. We call him Ötzi now, the Iceman, discovered in 1991 high in the Ötztal Alps, caught in a glacier between Austria and Italy. His body, over 5,000 years old, was older than the pyramids, older than the written word in most languages. But what fascinated the world wasn't just his age. It was what he carried beneath the surface. Tattoos, 61 of them, stark, dark carbon marks. No symbols of gods or animals, no stylized depictions of power, just lines, dots. Tracks down his spine, behind his knees, across his ankles. At first, it seemed simple, primitive, decorative maybe. But when researchers mapped those tattoos against modern acupuncture points, the air changed, because suddenly those marks weren't just ancient doodles. They were medicine, they were memory, they were treatment for pain, ritual for healing, or perhaps spells against mortality itself. Imagine that. 5,000 years ago, someone crouched beside a fire and pierced that man's skin, not for art, but for survival. That's where the story of tattoos begins, not in rebellion, not in aesthetics, but in the raw spaces where humans tried to hold on, to ward off what hurt, to make meaning out of pain. And Ötzi was not alone. Across the sands of ancient Egypt, tattoos appeared again, this time on women. Priestesses, dancers, mothers. They wore ink not to seduce, but to shield. Patterns wound across abdomens and thighs and chests, possibly to guard life where it began, in the womb. Symbols not meant for display, but for protection, for power, for fertility, for the divine. Further south, in Nubia, women were buried with tattoos of crocodiles and bulls, signs of strength and survival etched into the skin like prayers, not spoken, not written, just carried, silent, permanent. These early tattoos weren't decorative. They were declarations, not of status or vanity, but of ritual, of resilience, of the sacred. Because in a world without borders or books or medicine as we know it, the body was the one constant, the one scroll always present, the one altar always exposed. And tattoos were how humans wrote on it, how they claimed it. In those ancient days, an ink was not ink. It was ash, burnt plant, soot from a fire that had kept a village warm. It was mixed with fat or blood or spit. Tools weren't machines, they were sharpened bones, thorns, flint, and every mark made came with sting and risk. Infection, yes, but more than that. Transformation, because tattoos hurt. They were meant to. That was the point. The pain wasn't a flaw, it was the passage. To wear a tattoo was to endure, to prove, to believe. So when you see tattoos today, across gym arms, subway shoulders, celebrity necklines, understand that they are not new. They are ancient, older than bronze, older than kings. They are the first language of the flesh, a whisper from the bone, a record etched beneath the skin, and long before ink became fashion, it was faith. If you thought tattoos were mere decoration, try saying that in front of a Polynesian chief, and watch the silence fall like a curtain. Because in Polynesia, tattoos weren't art, they were identity. The very word tattoo comes from these islands, from the Tahitian word tatau, meaning to strike. And that's exactly how it began, with bone combs dipped in soot, tapped rhythmically into flesh using sticks and stone. Tap, 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 not a needle buzz. A drum beat. An invocation. Each strike echoed centuries of ancestry. Across Samoa, Tonga, and especially among the Maori of New Zealand, the body became a living record. Tattoos marked coming of age, social rank, bravery, beauty, grief, and belonging. They were not optional, they were expected, and once begun, they were never erased. Among the Maori, moko, those intricate facial tattoos, told your entire story before you spoke. The curve of a cheek pattern could reveal your family. A line along the brow could mark a battle survived. Every swirl, every spiral, every sharp-edged shadow carried meaning. The face wasn't a canvas, it was a resume, a map, a declaration. To remove it would be to erase a life. These designs were carved deep, not pricked. The tools cut the skin, then soot was pressed in. Bold, black, permanent. The pain was searing, but the process was sacred. It was a ceremony, not a service. And when the swelling passed and the ink settled, you weren't just changed, you were seen. Young men earned their tattoos through ritual trials, tests of courage, endurance, and silence. There were no anesthetics, no numbing balms. Just the community, the tools, and the will to become something more. Something marked, something remembered. Women, too, bore tattoos. Often on the lips, chin, or thighs. Not as ornament, but as signal of maturity, of womanhood, of mana, the spiritual force that flowed through all things. A woman without tattoos might be considered unfinished, a story left untold. Because here, the body wasn't shameful. It was sacred, a message, a vessel of myth. But then came missionaries. Sailing in with scissors, soap, and sermons, they tried to erase the ink with shame. They called the tattoos pagan, savage, sinful. In some places, the practice was outlawed, driven underground, turned into a whisper, a memory, a wound. But ink has a way of enduring. Today, across the Pacific, the sound of tattoo has returned, not as a trend, but as an act of resistance, reclamation, revival. Modern Polynesians are wearing the marks their grandparents were forced to hide. The ancient tools have come back, so have the ceremonies, so have the meanings. Because tattoo was never just about the design. It was about spirit. It was about blood. It was about standing in your ancestors' footsteps and saying, I remember, I belong, I endure. These were never just lines. They were legacy. Walk through the stone corridors of ancient Greece or Rome, and you might not expect to find tattoos. These were cultures that worshipped the ideal body, clean, sculpted, untouched. In their myths and marble, flesh was divine, pristine. But beneath the surface of statues and philosophy, another truth waited, a truth written in ink. The Greeks had a word for it, stigma. Yes, that word, the root of stigmata, of stigmatize. And back then, it meant exactly what it sounds like, a mark burned or pierced into the skin as punishment. A visible label that could not be washed away. Tattoos in ancient Greece weren't worn by heroes. They were carved into the flesh of prisoners, slaves, and captured enemies. A runaway slave might be tattooed on the forehead, forced to wear their failure across their face. The words might read, I ran away, or property, a message from the master to the world, permanent, shameful, inescapable. The Romans took this practice and refined it with the cold efficiency of an empire. In their vast army, tattoos sometimes marked loyalty. Soldiers, especially elite legionnaires, were inked to show their allegiance, living dog tags in iron helmets. But elsewhere in Roman society, tattoos spoke of control. Gladiators were branded to prevent escape. Criminals were marked to warn others. Slaves bore the names of their owners, sometimes across their arms, sometimes across their faces. And then came the Christians. Before Rome adopted Christianity, its followers were outcasts, rebels, threats to the state. Arrested, imprisoned, sometimes executed. Some were tattooed as a form of mockery, crosses etched onto their skin not as blessings, but as insults. But centuries later, those same believers turned that mark into a badge of faith. By the Middle Ages, Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem returned with tattoos, tiny crosses on their wrists or arms. Not fashion, not vanity, but proof. Proof they had endured, that they had walked the holy path, that they carried their belief not just in soul, but in skin. And yet, even as the faith turned, the body remained contested. When Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in Rome, he passed a curious law. Facial tattooing was forbidden. Not because it was cruel, but because the face, he said, was made in the image of God. It was sacred. It was not to be defiled. The body? Still fair game. So ink in the Greco-Roman world became complicated. On one hand, it was power, a way to mark ownership, to control identity, to brand human flesh like cattle. On the other, it was resistance, a symbol that, despite chains or conquest, a soul still endured. Unlike in Polynesia, where tattoos elevated you, Here they often dragged you down. They separated the free from the enslaved, the clean from the criminal. But even so, they told stories. Harsh stories. True stories, inked into arms that lifted swords, carried burdens, or folded in prayer. Because even when used as punishment, tattoos carried meaning. And meaning, once etched into flesh, doesn't fade easily. In the East, ink was never just ink. It was power. It was blessing. It was a dialogue between the seen and unseen. Here, tattooing wasn't always public. Sometimes it was secret, sacred, passed down through generations like stories or talismans. In India, in Japan, in the temples of Thailand and Cambodia, tattoos moved quietly, etched into warriors, monks, and mothers alike. Start in India.
Today, when people think of Indian body art, they often picture mehndi, henna, those intricate reddish-brown patterns painted onto hands and feet during weddings and festivals. But beneath the surface, India has a much deeper history with permanent tattoos, especially among its tribal communities. Among the Bega, Santhal, and Gond peoples, tattoos were not just beautiful, they were survival. They marked milestones, womanhood, rites of passage. A girl might be tattooed before marriage, not just to adorn her but to protect her. These weren't random designs. They were sacred geometry. Animals, spirits, fertility symbols. And once inked, they couldn't be stolen, unlike gold or cloth. In times of famine or exile, a woman's tattoos became her only possession, her only jewelry that no one could take. The process was intimate. A grandmother or elder, armed with a thorn and homemade ink, bent over her granddaughter's skin, whispering stories as she worked. Pain and patience mingled, skin bled, and when it healed, the story remained. Now turn east to Japan. There, the story of tattoos is even more tangled. In Japan's early days, during the Jomon period, tattoos may have been spiritual, marks to protect or identify, much like tribal India. But centuries later, the story twisted. Tattoos became a sentence. Criminals were marked visibly. A thief might be tattooed with the kanji for dog or evil. A forehead scarred with ink meant you belonged to shame. But even from this punishment grew a quiet rebellion. In the shadows of cities, outcasts began reclaiming the ink. Firemen, laborers, gamblers, and eventually the Yakuza, Japan's infamous organized syndicates, began covering their entire bodies in elaborate art. These were not small designs. These were masterpieces. Ayers-Yumi full-body tattoos wrapped men in koi fish, dragons, samurai, cherry blossoms. Hours became months. Pain became legacy. Each design was a personal mythology sewn beneath the surface like armor. They wore suits during the day, respectable, quiet. But beneath those layers, a second skin burned bright with symbolism. Power, loyalty, silence. Meanwhile, in the golden temples of Southeast Asia, monks prepared a different kind of ink. In Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos, sak yant tattoos emerged, not as fashion but as spiritual armor. These were geometric patterns, sacred animals, ancient Khmer script, etched by holy men into the skin of soldiers, bodyguards, and believers. Each tattoo was chanted into place. The monk held a sharpened bamboo rod or steel needle. The receiver sat still, praying, enduring. And as the design sank in, so did the blessing. The ink was mixed with herbs, ash, sometimes snake venom or tiger whisker, rare, powerful ingredients believed to contain spirits. And once done, the monk whispered incantations. The tattoo wasn't just complete, it was awakened. These tattoos promised more than beauty. They offered protection from bullets, courage in war, luck in love. They were invisible shields, spiritual contracts, and they came with rules, codes of conduct. Break them and the magic faded. In India, tattoos were inheritance. In Japan, resistance. In Southeast Asia, religion. But in all three, they were sacred. Not rebellion, not vanity, not rebellion inked on a Saturday night. They were something older, something deeper. A reminder that for much of human history, the skin was not just a body. It was a shrine. By the time the modern world had taken shape, with borders drawn, armies armed, and cities built, tattoos had already crossed oceans, bled through cultures, and embedded themselves in every corner of humanity. But in one place, they evolved into something grittier, sharper, and more dangerous: the prison. Here, ink wasn't art. It was code. Step into a Russian gulag in the mid-20th century, and you wouldn't need to ask a man what he'd done, where he stood, or whether to fear him. You could read it. His chest, his back, his knuckles. They were a biography written in bruises and soot-inked scars. A cathedral with 5 domes inked across the torso. That meant 5 prison terms. A spider crawling up the neck. He'd committed his crimes young. Barbed wire around the neck, life sentence. No chance of parole. And if a man wore a star on each shoulder, it wasn't decoration. It was a demand: do not touch me. These tattoos weren't just marks. They were survival. Break the code, wear a symbol you didn't earn, and you wouldn't be corrected, you'd be cut. Brutally. Sometimes by your own gang, sometimes by a stranger. The skin was truth. If it lied, it paid. Meanwhile, across the globe, a different underworld was also telling stories in ink. Japan's Yakuza. We've seen glimpses of them before. Those sprawling full-body tattoos that covered everything but the face, hands, and neck. Hidden beneath suits, behind calm expressions. These weren't symbols of rebellion but of belonging, a mark of loyalty to something larger than self. A family, a code, a silence. Getting Ayurzyumi was an act of devotion. It took hundreds of hours. It cost months of wages. The pain was legendary. No machines, just tebori, a hand-poking technique with needles tied to a stick, each line tapped in by hand. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was a ritual, a proving ground. Some wore koi fish swimming upstream for perseverance. Others wore dragons for protection. Each tattoo was earned, and once complete, never shown in public unless absolutely necessary. But even outside the Yakuza and gulags, tattoos in the criminal world continued to evolve. In American prisons, a teardrop under the eye might mean murder or mourning. A clock with no hands meant doing time with no end. 3 dots in a triangle near the eye. Mi vida loca, my crazy life. But none of this was decorative. These weren't choices made in parlors. These were done with razors, staples, melted pen ink, behind bars, under threat, with no gloves, no sterilization, no second chances. And yet for many inmates the pain was part of the point. It was control. In a system designed to strip you of name, clothes, rights, and voice, the tattoo was something that couldn't be taken away. It was the one thing the system couldn't steal. A mark that said, I belong to me. Of course, outside prison walls, these tattoos carried weight. A warning, a history, a stigma. Jobs were denied, assumptions were made. But for those who wore them, they weren't looking for sympathy. They were holding on to memory, to loss, to rage, to family, to something real in a world that erased everything else. In this world, ink didn't just decorate the body. It defended it. It was armor. As the 20th century roared to life, steam engines blazing, cities swelling, war drums sounding across oceans, tattoos stepped back into the light. Not suddenly, not cleanly, but steadily. Rising from dungeons, from war camps, from ships and prisons and ruins, the ancient language of ink began to speak again. And this time, the world was ready to listen. The first to wear them openly were the outliers, the performers, the illustrated women, the strongmen with dragons on their backs and saints on their chests. In circus tents and traveling shows, they stood beneath spotlights, skin on display like a living museum. People stared. Gasps followed. The ink that once shamed prisoners now drew crowds. These weren't tattoos for survival anymore. They were spectacle. Stories told across shoulders, ribs, and spines. Wild animals, crucifixes. Names of lovers, battles won, children lost, faces remembered, icons reborn. And yet, beyond the freak show, another group carried ink with far less fanfare but far more pain: soldiers. Across Europe and the Pacific, men marched into World War I, then II, with youth in their hearts and fear in their packs. On their arms they etched their names, their blood types, their mother's initials. Some tattooed their units. Others added anchors, eagles, or roses, not for glory, but for identification, so that if they died far from home, someone could return them to it. Tattoos in war weren't rebellion. They were memory made permanent. A message written in case the mouth never got the chance to speak it. Then came peace, and with it, the explosion of ink into every corner of culture. Sailors, as always, led the charge. After returning from long voyages, their tattoos told stories more honest than words. An anchor meant stability. A compass, hope. Swallows for safe return. A dagger through a rose for every love left behind. Their skin was stamped with ports, griefs, adventures. You could read a man's past before he said a word. By mid-century, tattoo parlors appeared in alleyways and basements. Seedy, smoky, but alive. Bikers, rebels, and rock stars walked in, each looking to wear something permanent in a world that erased everything too fast. In the 1960s and 70s, tattoos became protest. Political, personal. Janis Joplin wore a bracelet inked around her wrist like armor. The Hells Angels wore patches beneath their leather jackets, symbols of chaos, loyalty, and rage. To be tattooed, then, was still to be outside. But for many, that was the point, to say, I do not belong to your order, I choose my own. But the world kept changing. In the 80s and 90s, tattoos began to climb out of the underground and into the mainstream. More artists emerged, more styles bloomed, the machines improved, and slowly society loosened its grip. Suddenly, athletes had sleeves. Rappers wore portraits of their children across their chests. Women reclaimed the ink once denied to them. Roses, scripts, galaxies, scars turned to vines. From locker rooms to boardrooms, from baristas to bankers, ink spread like wildfire. And with it came meaning. Not all tattoos were loud. Some were small, a date, a sound wave, a word only one other person understood, coordinates of where someone died or where someone was born. For some, tattoos became a kind of therapy, a way to remember what shouldn't be forgotten, a way to mark survival after trauma, a way to reclaim a body once taken or violated. Technology entered the scene too. Today, AI helps generate perfect designs. Machines print ink with surgical precision. Labs even experiment with smart tattoos, biosensors that track your heart rate or light up with LED pigment. What was once ritual is now on the edge of science fiction. And yet, something ancient still lingers beneath the surface. Even with all the tech, all the noise, all the trends and hashtags, the core remains unchanged. A tattoo is still a choice, a declaration, a moment frozen in skin. And the pain, still there, still part of the deal, still proof that something was worth enduring. From Ötzi's aching joints to the prayer-laced scripts on a monk's spine, from a runaway slave marked in shame to a daughter honoring her lost mother, from forbidden Mary Moke to a suburban dad's sleeve of Norse symbols. Tattoos have always been one thing above all else. A story only your skin can tell. And so the ink endures. Because long after buildings crumble, after empires fall, after memory fades, one truth remains. We are creatures who mark, who bleed meaning, who write our joy and grief into the only surface we carry from birth to death, our own bodies. So whether you wear ink or simply witness it, understand this, that beneath every tattoo is not just pigment, but memory, belief, identity, spirit. The past didn't die, it rides beneath our skin.